Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
What kills democracy? Democracy dies when people who think the Constitution is racist and that natural rights are a figment of the imagination of old dead white men turn over the control of setting the rules of the regime to a class of functionaries who cannot be removed from power by voting, and then conscript a mass of people who hardly would even recognize citizenship if it slapped them in the face to put a rubber plebiscitary stamp on whatever the ruling class chunks out day in and day out. That's how democracy dies. And the fact that, there isn't even the slightest whiff, there isn't even a grain of acknowledgement that this is something that is not, oh no, a what if around the corner, but something that has already happened and something that we've been living with for years. It's just disqualifying. There's no point in trying to engage with this material.
Welcome, everyone, to The American Mind, the Publishers and Editors podcast. Here at The American Mind at the Claremont Institute, I'm your host, Ryan Williams, publisher of The American Mind and the Claremont Review Books, and president of the Claremont Institute. I'm joined by Matt Peterson, vice president of education, founding editor of The American Mind, Spencer Clavin, features editor at The American Mind and associate editor at the Claremont Review Books, Seth Barron, managing editor of The American Mind, and last but not least, James Pullis, executive editor of The American Mind. I wanted to start today with this piece from Bob Kagan in the Washington Post. So Bob does these long essays for WAPO, maybe once a quarter, and then does his normal stuff for them more frequently. These are the kind of big think pieces. This one is called Our Constitutional Crisis is Already Here, I believe the title is. And I think it's revealing. Bob is an old neocon of, impeccable credential and government advising cachet. He kind of speaks for the establishment blob in Washington, both center left and center right. So he's a nice cipher for our ruling class in many ways. Now, I don't mean to do Bob a disservice by lumping him in with some of the more execrable members of that ruling class, but nonetheless, there are many that are much worse than Bob. And he's, his career is interesting and his scholarship is worth looking at, but he does occupy this position. So he worries very much in this piece about a 2024 Trump run. He basically says Trump is running and no one will be able to stop him. He's, amassing a campaign war chest and laying the organizational groundwork for a run. No one in the Republican Party will stand in his way. Bob thinks this is a terrible thing. I just want to read a few paragraphs, and then we can talk about it a little bit, and then I'll read the closing, and we can continue to discuss. It pairs nicely also with this other Washington Post piece, almost as if some of the coverage of Trump and the Republican Party and the future of it is coordinated from time to time at WAPO. Pairs the thought. So this is just a few paragraphs in. This is Bob talking about 2020. Meanwhile, the amateurish Stop the Steal efforts of 2020 have given way to an organized nationwide campaign to ensure that Trump and his supporters will have the control over state and local election officials that they lacked in 2020. Those recalcitrant Republican state officials who effectively saved the country from calamity by refusing to falsely declare fraud or to find more votes for Trump are being systematically removed or hounded from office. Republican legislatures are giving themselves greater control over the election and certification process. As of this spring, Republicans have proposed or passed measures in at least 16 states that would shift certain election authorities from the purview of the governor, secretary of state, or other executive branch officers to the legislature. An Arizona bill flatly states that the legislature may revoke the secretary of state's issuance or certification of a presidential elector's certificate of election by a simple majority vote. Some state legislatures seek to impose criminal penalties on local election officials alleged to have committed technical infractions, including obstructing the view of poll watchers. That's Yeah, that's the end of that sentence. Then, about in the middle of the piece, this is Bob talking about conservative intellectuals. As for conservative intellectuals, even those who had spent years arguing that Woodrow Wilson was a tyrant because he created the Federal Reserve and supported child labor laws, seemed to have no concerns about whether Trump was a would-be despot. They not only came to Trump's defense, but fashioned political doctrines to justify his rule, filling in the wide gaps of his non-existent ideology with appeal to conservative nationalism and conservative populism. Perhaps American conservatism was never comfortable with the American experiment in liberal democracy, but certainly since Trump took over their party, many conservatives have revealed a hostility to core American beliefs. Just one more. Now, Bob's talking about 2024. Should Trump take over, or should he win, I should say? But this time, Trump would have advantages that he lacked in 2016 and 2020, including more loyal officials in state and local governments, the Republicans in Congress, and the backing of GOP donors, think tanks, and journals of opinion. And he will have the Trump movement, including many who are armed and ready to be activated again. Who is going to stop him then? On its current trajectory, the 2024 Republican Party will make the 2020 Republican Party seem positively defiant. Only total loyalists would serve at the head of the Justice Department, FBI, CIA, National Security Agency, and the Pentagon. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs will not be someone likely to place his or her own judgment above that of their civilian commander-in-chief. Nor would a Republican Senate fail to confirm Trump loyalists. In such a world, with Trump and his lieutenants in charge of all the levers of state power, including its growing capacity for surveillance, opposing Trump would become increasingly risky for Republicans and Democrats alike. A Trump victory is likely to mean at least the temporary suspension of American democracy as we have known it. So there's lots going on in this piece. I skipped around a bit, but I think those all captured, I think, largely the view of the ruling class in the country. Let's unpack some of this. So the first bit about election fraud, Kagan laments the fact that Republicans, through, as far as we can tell, mostly democratic processes, are appointing their people to be in charge or to be majority in charge of certain electoral processes, and they're also devolving control from state executives back down to more representative institutions. This is alarming to Bob Kagan, but given the trajectory of American politics and actually the explicit language in the federal Constitution about state legislatures deciding the manner and nature of how elections are conducted for presidents in their state, I find it much less alarming. In fact, you could argue, one could complain, and I'm sure this is one of Bob's complaints, but the structural complaint falls pretty flat. He thinks it's bad because these are just loyalists and they're trying to wrest control. But as far as some of us can tell, this is really how the system is supposed to operate. It was really never really intended that state judicial bodies or state executive branch officials would have such control over the elections or over the conduct of elections as they did in 2020. In fact, a lot of the things that are in dispute are the fact that in Michigan and in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, et cetera, these state executives, often with a Republican legislature not then in session and not called into session, basically unilaterally declared, signature verification now waived, more time for ballots to become in and counted, arguably subverting democracy in the sense of the constitutional procedure for counting all these votes. So, that's just the first part of it. The second part of it is that conservative movement that it gives you a window into Bob Kagan, what he thinks of American conservatism now, or maybe has always thought of it. He said maybe it never really believed in American liberal democracy. The question, and this will be a theme as we move through this discussion and quote it a bit more after we have a chance to talk, is that whose liberal democracy is the real question. That's the question that's always presumed by Kagan and others, but it's something that needs some unpacking. And then finally, this last bit, all it seems, you could read it like Kagan did. He's again scared because he thinks all these Trump's people being in place and his loyalists being in place in his own administration is very frightening because he thinks that Trump is a dictator and they'll just do what he wants. But to me, another reading would be, especially to even moderate Trump supporters, would be, no, look, he's building a grievance over 2020. He rebuilds his popularity, or continues to build on his popularity. He wins office in 2024, and then he finally gets the personnel process correct. Now, Kagan says this is likely to mean at least the temporary suspension of American democracy as we've known it. I don't know what he means. I guess he means until impeachment or something. But to a lot of us, it just looks like governing finally with people who want to carry out your agenda. So this is just very, very illustrative of the gap, I think, between understanding and premises on both sides of this issue. And so Kagan's useful for that because he's an articulate and learned purveyor of this view. And look, Kagan, I think, operating in good faith. I think a lot of us just disagree with his premises and his judgment of Trump.
Well, especially the premise that that tyranny is whatever your opponent is doing. I mean, I still don't understand. Nobody has ever pointed out to me anything tyrannical, authoritarian, dictator-like, anti-democratic that Trump ever actually did. I mean, to me, it seemed like he was entirely, like maybe too respectful of procedure and precedent. Like every time, and we've talked about this, but every time a district court judge enjoined something that he was doing, he would say, okay, well, I guess we have to wait 2 years for it to get to the Supreme Court. And the idea that, I mean, the way Kagan says, oh my God, if Trump comes in, we're going to have his supporters running the FBI and the State Department and the Justice Department. Like, what does that, I mean, I should hope. I mean, that would be a good start if it were true, which I'm not entirely confident about. But I mean, this is just the same thing we've been hearing for years, that there's been some dissolution of norms, that Trump represents this disaster, that he's completely discontinuous with democratic processes. I still don't even see it. It just seems like it's just hand waving.
Yeah, it is interesting to me because, Ryan, as you say, this is clearly a learned man. He's clearly read a great deal and thought quite a bit about, historical precedent. And yet I can't help reading this longer piece and finding in it just a kind of cartoonish description, not only of American history or modern history, but just of like European history writ large. It's this idea, it's kind of like the logic of Hitler comparisons just extended outward into the entirety of everything that has ever happened in the West. I mean, the general idea here is that, people went along under minute surveillance by autocratic regimes wherein they could be burned at the stake for the most minor infraction until finally the clear light of sort of the Reformation, but really just the Enlightenment, brought this wonderful thing called conscience and freedom thereof into being. And everything ever since then has just been an opposition between that idea that, we can be liberals or we can be, as Seth says, authoritarians, right? Those are the only options. We talk about a binary worldview. Here's a paragraph, right? This is a description of, pre-freedom of consciousness, pre-liberalism Europe. The shifting religious doctrines promulgated in Rome or Wittenberg or London on such matters as the meaning of the Eucharist were transmitted down to the smallest parishes. The humblest peasant could be burned at the stake for deviating from orthodoxy. Anyone from the lowest to the highest could be subjected to the most horrific tortures and executions on the order of the king or the pope. Only with the advent of Enlightenment liberalism did people begin to believe that the individual conscience, as well as the individual's body, should be inviolate and protected from the intrusions of state and church. Now, far be it from me to deny that as the church consolidated its power over Europe, it engaged in some moments of overreach, and there were periods of time, perhaps in localities where this is a true description of everyday life. But was it true of England during the Magna Carta or the Peasants' Revolt? I mean, what exactly is the period of time during which this is supposed to be a totalizing description of pre-Enlightenment Europe? I would like to know, right? And go back even further, Pericles talking to the Greeks about how great it is that nobody gives anyone else a sidelong look about his personal choices. I mean, this is like a cartoonish description of history that basically smushes the entirety of 2,500 years into like one story, black versus white, and Trump is black and everybody who is against him is the good guys, right? If you really are afraid about living in a world where your every move can be watched over by a theocratic regime, like maybe you should be thinking about some of the things that Trump's opponents did in the lead up to the election. Maybe you should talk about how a sitting president was kicked off of the most powerful platform in the country. But no, it's all about Enlightenment liberalism. Everything is great now until Trump, and he's the evil bad guy, and we should all be afraid.
We should know quickly too. Sorry, James, that Spencer was reading there from this other, even longer Kagan piece from March 2019, which is worth study, called "The Strong Men Strike Back." Anyway, go ahead, James.
Yeah, I mean, The Atlantic loses tons of money. It's where Jeffrey Goldberg convinces prestige intellectuals to make bad faith arguments to put pressure on to the court, the people in court, so that they can either, dispense with the deplorables in the right way, or they in turn can put pressure on the king. And I think that's why all these, ludicrous arguments, quote unquote arguments, are being made to rile people up on the left to put pressure on the Biden administration. This is clearly a reflection of the fact that, the potentate class is getting nervous. They recognize that Biden is just kind of a rolling disaster. No one has any confidence in Kamala. So you get pieces like this where, you have to drag the boogeyman back out of retirement. For people who are not sitting around high-fiving each other because the Trump era number 2 is just going to, automatically switch in just a few years. There are real questions on the right about who's going to run in 24, who should run, who should get the nomination. This is, like any regular, normal political season, there are lively internal discussions and debates about who best represents or can lead the party going forward. And of course, that whole dynamic, which would seem to be important in an analysis like this, is just erased from the presentation. And all the predictable tropes about how Trump incited insurrection when the news now begrudgingly admits quite the contrary. They're all there, and the only reason why I think this piece was written is just to simply apply institutional pressure onto Biden and his flunkies who are flunking right now.
Should we reiterate the only true part of the article? This is my favorite sentence, that they believe their bond with Trump has little to do with economics or other material concerns, right? They believe the US government and society has been captured by socialists, minority groups, and sexual deviants.
I don't know.
Good point.
They see the Republican Party establishment as corrupt and weak losers, quote unquote, to use Trump's word, unable to challenge the reigning liberal hegemony. They view Trump as strong and defiant, willing to take on the establishment, yada, yada. And this is of a piece with, right, the Lincoln Project and the whole official Washington, D.C. uniparty, can't we all get along dogma. And it's that this is not anymore about Republican versus Democrat. This is a war for the sake of protecting democracy itself. And democracy itself entails locking down the entire nation and brutally enforcing whatever the hell they want to do, and they want to enforce Constitution and everything else be damned. So it's a joke, but this rhetoric is still powerful in a way, a testament to the wisp of, I don't know, ghost spirit that's still left in America, because they feel as if he needs to present this argument in a very traditional way, appealing to the Constitution and the separation of powers and so forth and so on. And it's, democracy that's under attack. And I mean, there's something to the way they cling to this kind of, let's call it trad Washington, which is diseased and corrupt and terrible thing. They cling to these rags because they know they still have to, I suppose. And they think it'll rally, especially the opposite of the gentry. I mean, the people in a vulnerable position who want to move up into American elite society. It's this catechism for them. Like, you have to believe this. Democracy itself is under assault. And everyone who supports Trump is a crazy person who wants to overthrow the United States of America. And that's, that is what it is. I mean, other than like yell at the kind of people who are still reading the Washington Post and taking it seriously, I guess that still has purchasing power. But there is, I mean, if there's one upside in this, which I just find infuriating, I can't even really get through the article without having to stop. But I tried a bunch of times before this podcast, when it came out. I think the silver lining though is simply that this is wearing thin. Maybe that doesn't matter because it still has purchasing power with the people that it's supposed to scare the crap out of. But for everyone else, I mean, this is increasingly sounding like a more and more elaborate constructed fairy tale land that exists in the District of Columbia in the heads of commentators. And increasingly, I don't know. Will that have purchase? I guess so if they enforce it on us.
I'm sorry to harp on the bad history here, but to your point, Matt, I think, and to others that have been made, right? Here's another passage from that longer article. The founders did not, italics emphasis, the founders did not claim that Americans' rights derived from English political culture and tradition. As Alexander Hamilton put it, the sacred rights of mankind were not to be found among parchments or musty records, but were written as with a sunbeam by the hand of divinity itself, and thus could never be erased or obscured by mortal power. Now, again, not to deny that there was an Enlightenment strain of sort of abstract, rational thought inherent in the founding project, but leave aside for just a moment the repeated talk of the rights of Englishmen that the colonists were constantly claiming during the time. Here's another interview with one of the people who fought at Concord in 1775. What was the matter, asked the interviewer, and what did you mean in going to fight? This Minuteman says, young man, what we meant going for those redcoats was this. We had always governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean that we should. Abstracting this like perfectionist notion of like divine rights that don't need any kind of demonstration or defense or rootedness in tradition, right? This kind of anti-Burkean idea that it all just came like it all just plunged down like a sunbeam into the hearts of men. How's that working out for you? How's it working out for you to rely on people to just intuit what the American regime and the American project is supposed to be? I mean, do these people look around them ever? Do they notice that like the entirety of the thing is crumbling around them and they continue to repeat and repeat these bromides about like abstract truths and, universal principles that we just get to intuit with like magical power of our inborn phronesis? Like, what is this? And why do we get to do we have to continue listening to these people as if they had any sort of authority about like, what's going to save America? The whole thing is collapsing as we go. I mean, I guess, James, you must be right that this is like a kind of intra-court appeal for some kind of, pat on the head and extra authority in the new regime.
But they seem to be able to keep it going. I mean, when Trump won, I should have assumed, okay, we're going to get a respite back in 2016, and they'll give him a chance to do something. But it immediately started. And the entire cathedral regime, the entire party just, coalesced around this narrative, and it never stopped. I mean, all we heard about for years was collusion, treason, urine. I mean, it just became insane. And I guess it has purchase to the extent that like someone yelling in your ear has purchase. I mean, eventually you'd rather go deaf than argue with it or try to hide from it. It doesn't seem like they have any. They don't flag. They just it's nice to think that maybe this is just all echo chamber stuff, but if they control the entire the megaphone and all the amplification, I mean, I guess that's all they need.
Yeah, I mean, that may be the case. This is a very conservative argument, right? Was what I was trying to say earlier. And that's what makes it, in a way, so sickening to me. I mean, the fact that you're going to say that Trump supporters don't have any sense of Republican virtue or love of Republican government. I can't even do it. But it is very true that it's worked so far. It continues to work. and it seems like there is some constituency that is living in denial that this kind of rhetoric helps, because this is not written for a woke person, right? This article, this is written for the kind of the functionaries, more the midwits, but the people who are still kind of in this place of denial, who are lorded over by the uppers and want to move up. That's all I can figure.
Yeah, it's the Washington Post is useful. Matt, you asked who takes it seriously. Seth mentioned it, but the cathedral does. It's what's the old line? I forget. It was we heard it at a recent super secret conference that some of us were at. The New York Times, it wasn't McNamara, but George McBundy maybe said that the New York Times is the most effective inter-office memo system that they'd ever had in the executive branch. I think the Washington Post now is pretty similar. New York Times, they're all kind of an amalgamation in that sense. They are a sort of ruling class inter-office memo system, and that ruling class now encompasses government media. It always kind of did, but it seems more ironclad now. Government media and the permanent bureaucracy and the political appointees who happen to be aligned with the permanent bureaucracy. So that's why it's interesting and why I bring it up. And I know you guys all know that, but it's worth pointing out. Let me just read this second to last paragraph. So prescriptively, basically, Kagan ends this thing by saying Mitt Romney and others, they don't need to leave the Republican Party, but they need to basically make the pitch for some grand bipartisan coalition to save American democracy. Maybe they team up with the Democrats on just like the three most important things: immigration, election stuff, and COVID or something. As if there could be any real agreement on the immigration question. I guess maybe with Romney and Democrats, perhaps. But he ends it by saying the many things they should do, among them should be this: heading into the next election, it is vital to protect election workers, same-day registration, and early voting. It will also still be necessary to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which directly addresses the state legislature's electoral power grab. Now, this is sort of a beefing up of the original Voting Rights Act. It's not to be confused with the more radical prescriptive Voting Rights Act that the Democrats wanted to pass. But this is just a quick description of what the John Lewis Act would do from New York Magazine. And it's in reference to sections 4 and 5 of the original Voting Rights Act. So the far more powerful sections 4 and 5 created a system whereby jurisdictions with a history of discriminatory practices would have to submit changes in voting and election laws to the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department for review and pre-clearance as non-discriminatory before they could take effect. This is really the rub, and it gets me to a theme that has come up repeatedly on this podcast with us, which is, the current kind of post, again, to bring up our colleague Chris Caldwell's formulation of all this, the post-Civil Rights Act system of justice and discrimination and anti-discrimination, and good and bad and right and wrong, has warped in many ways the traditional equal protection of the laws that we would argue was envisioned by the 14th Amendment and really originally envisioned in the Declaration of Independence. So that's where the rub is. The current kind of racialized, disparate impact focused, that legal term, where if groups have unequal outcomes, then it must be the result of racism. That's in the courts for many decades now. Affirmative action, all the rest. This whole edifice that's grown up, we would argue, in contravention of the spirit of the 14th Amendment, the spirit of the Declaration, the spirit of true equal protection of equal laws. That's what they want to enshrine in voting law and everything else. So a Justice Department in a Biden administration that would pre-clear any changes to electoral law, it's really a dispute over the meaning of equal protection and the meaning of what elections are supposed to secure. So again, we're back to fundamental things. The Republicans, let's sit in Bob Kagan's shoes, if he could even envision some of good faith local Republican officials who thought there was some shenanigans last election, they just wanted to fix it. They didn't want to rig it for Trump. They didn't want to rig it for anybody. Even those people making good faith efforts to wrest some transparency back from state election officials on how elections proceed. If there's even a whiff or even a pretense can be found that these changes somehow disproportionately affect minority voters despite their facially neutral purpose, they wouldn't be pre-cleared. They wouldn't be allowed to act. It's just that this is the rub. This is what the argument's about. So in many ways, a lot of these arguments are sort of conducted in bad faith, where a lot of people that read them don't realize that we're disputing over the premises themselves. And so we're led round and round again and misunderstand each other. And so anyway, I just wanted to get that point in. It dovetails nicely with this piece that Seth sent around. This is my last Walpole quote, I promise. This one's in many ways a companion piece published yesterday. Kagan's piece came out on Friday, and it's by Ashley Parker. The headline is, "As Trump hints at 2024 comeback, democracy advocates fear a worst case scenario for the country." Just 2 paragraphs from the second page. So the second possible scenario experts envision is more insidious, a sort of slow boiling frog of American democracy. In this case, Trump, or an acolyte with similarly anti-democratic sensibilities, runs and wins legitimately in 2024, emerging newly emboldened and focused on retribution. Then the new president, intent on strengthening his own position and punishing critics, begins remaking the political and electoral system, using legal means to consolidate power and erode democratic institutions. We often think that what we should be waiting for is fascists and communists marching in the streets. But nowadays, the ways democracies often die is through legal things at the ballot box. So things that can be both legal and anti-democratic at the same time, said Daniel Ziblatt, a professor at Harvard University and the author of How Democracies Die, who's working on a successive volume. Politicians use the letter of the law to subvert the spirit of the law. That's my point. The spirit of the law is what's at issue, and the spirit of the law for a good portion of especially the elite left or the establishment, left and right in the country, the sort of establishment parties, that is, they've swallowed hook, line, and sinker that the way we do civil rights now is this new apparatus where and equal results, including in access to the polls, everything from access to the polls, maybe a more fundamental thing, to boardroom seats, to everything else. Unless we have equal access and equal results across groups, somehow it's systemic racism, and we ought to throw it out, and we ought to use the levers of power, both federal and state, to undo the equal protection of equal laws, even though unequal outcomes resulted. So that's the rub. The spirit of the law is the rub, and so we hurtle on.
Look, I mean, people like Kagan simply lack the standing to intervene in these debates, in these discussions. Like what kills democracy? Democracy dies when people who think the Constitution is racist and that natural rights are a figment of the imagination of old dead white men turn over the control of setting the rules of the regime to a class of functionaries who cannot be removed from power by voting, and then conscript a mass of people who hardly would even recognize citizenship if it slapped them in the face, to put a rubber plebiscitary stamp on whatever the ruling class chunks out day in and day out. That's how democracy dies. And the fact that, there isn't even the slightest whiff, there isn't even a grain of acknowledgement that this is something that is not, oh no, a what if around the corner, but something that has already happened and something that we've been living with for years. It's just disqualifying. There's no point in trying to engage with this material.
Yeah, all good points, James. Well, I think we've beaten that one to death. But for those interested, just the 2 reference points. The Strongmen Strike Back, March 2019, Kagan's long think piece about why Trump's bad and why he's sort of reversing the march of history that Kagan and his friends so ably defended and instantiated after the Soviet Union fell. And then this latest one from Friday, Our Constitutional Crisis, is already here. We wanted to talk about the American Political Science Association. Always a fun topic. And our colleague John Eastman, we have had for over 35 years now panels at the American Political Science Association. It's the largest social science conference in the world. usually 4,000 to 6,000 attendees or so. I know it sounds frightening, but we go there so you don't have to, everyone. And we'll hold panels, usually 12 to 15 of them. We get to set our own agenda. We're there as a related group. We're part of the program, but we're not subject to the normal, kind of submission rules of APSA. We get to fashion our own program. So we'll talk about the Supreme Court's last term. We'll talk about contentious elections. We'll do some political philosophy stuff that's a little more academic, especially providing opportunities for young grad students to share their work, to get feedback, all this kind of stuff. So it's usually a mix for us. And last year it was fully virtual, which was quite a come down from the normal experience at APSA. Whatever we want to say about the social scientific community, and they can be a dull and tendentious bunch, or just sort of obsessed with the tiniest minutia and not very interesting. But it's a chance for us and for all of our friends who like to come to our panels, friends across the academy. We get together every year. We host a reception. It's a good time. Everyone gets to catch up. And learn some stuff and catch up. Talk to each other. So last year was a bust, all virtual because of COVID. This year it's hybrid. The political science profession, probably very, very vaccinated, is still pretty scared of COVID. So it's going to be, I read from Dan Dresner, who wrote a little Washington Post hit piece on this, about a quasi hit piece about this whole episode. More on that in a minute. He wrote that from his investigations and his asking of APSA administration, that about 2,500 people were going to be there in person, and then 3,000 were going to be virtual. So it was this hybrid format. We had no interest in a hybrid format. Most of our presenters don't either. They weren't interested in doing virtual. So we said, no, we want all of our panels live. So instead of doing 15 or 12, we did 10. That was APSA's agreement with us. About 6 weeks ago in late July, we got a notice from them that 2 of our panels were now being forced to go virtual. Lo and behold, those were panels with John Eastman on them. It wasn't put that way to us, but that was the one common data point between the 2. So this was obvious to us what was going on. We pressed the executive director of APSA, Steve Smith, about why. He said safety concerns. So we said, oh, interesting. What kind of safety concerns? Because we'd like to, take precautions if we thought our institution as a whole might be at risk in Seattle. He was unwilling to disclose details. John, we were going to take those panels and hold them off-site, but still in Seattle on our own anyway. So we hired some security, and we're going to do that. John notified the FBI, that is John Eastman, and local police. Local police basically said it wasn't any of their business. It was the conference's job to make sure we were safe, and the FBI never got back to John. So that's where we were until Friday. That is September 24th, last Friday. And at which point, in a mass email, us and all of our participants got notice from APSA that the full Claremont Institute program would now be virtual. No explanation. And again, this Dan Dresner piece, he reached out to Steve Smith. Steve Smith at APSA never told us why, but Dresner says that Smith eventually disclosed that, yes, it was concern over protests. So in the past, we'd had some controversial people speak. John Yoo used to be the bête noire of the political science community because of his participation in the Bush administration's quote unquote torture memos. So they had protested us in the past on John's panels. APSA usually worked with us to try to keep protesters from disrupting it, in pretty good faith, frankly. And we were just very sad to see that this year they completely caved to the mob. The plot thickened, of course. The precipitous events for moving the whole thing virtual was that this CNN article came out kind of excerpting and recapitulating a piece of the upcoming book by Bob Woodward and Robert Costa called Peril, which is about the 2020 election between Election Day and January 6th. And they published a truncated version of a draft memo that John Eastman had sent as President Trump's counsel, I think on January 4th, for discussion between Vice President Pence and the president about what their options were while the electoral count was going on, given the fact that you had some of these state legislators who were Republicans who weren't in session to be able to contest the certification of their electoral votes, who had subsequently found reason to be worried about the validity of their certification. They were raising some issue of this and wanted a delay to see if they could get to the bottom of it. So that's all the background. The memo came out, and the people who quoted the memo basically just quoted the piece of it where John is wargaming parts of this, and this is not what he ended up recommending. John's going to write this up. It'll be out shortly, his whole explanation for it. But they took a truncated form, and basically he was denounced as a traitor and an insurrectionist and a coup instigator. So an open letter by a couple hundred of the APSA members started circulating, saying that the APSA should rescind John's membership, or really should strip him of membership and then rescind our classification as a related group. So that's where we were. It gained steam. I suspect people started threatening APSA or saying that they were going to protest or it should be shut down. And if they didn't shut it down, it would be shut down. You could predict how all of this went. That's all of the background. We've made fun of the American Political Science Association in the past. I just point everyone to this nice old piece from Harry V. Jaffa, which we republished on the American Mind, called Political Philosophy and Honor, in which Jaffa argued against the Leo Strauss Award being handed over to administrators at APSA. His argument being, this is a fundamentally political organization. The last thing it's going to be able to reward is actual freedom, free thought, and they certainly won't be able to honor Leo Strauss, who spent his entire life really denouncing and critiquing the modern political science profession for being unserious, among other things, and philosophically kind of tendentious Anyway, I will just read a few panels that the APSA thinks are fine, even though they want to send us all to virtual and not defend us against protesters. This is from recent years, last 3 years or so. Then we can open it up. A duty to resist when disobedience should be uncivil, or confronting patriarchy in government institutions and policies. Another panel called Stuff White People Think, or another one called Cities as Sites of Resistance. This one's, of course, from this year, with a nod to General Milley. The Origins of White Rage in the Trump Era. And then finally, Critical Theory Today, Rethinking Agency, Domination, and Revolution. Well, I'll just finish by saying, I think a lot of us are glad we don't have to go to Seattle. It used to be a fun place to visit. It's now crawling with homeless people, and sort of has gone, not quite as badly, but has gone the way of San Francisco and other cities. But it's a shame that this organization, which used to be a little more open to free thought, even though it was pretty politically one-sided, now seems to be trending towards the worst tendencies of modern cancel culture. And the thing that's going to be lost as a result is really a last little corner of it that is us. There are others, but we were a big part of it, where folks could have some diversity of thought. It's a shame.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk in lofty, yearning, abstract terms about like enlightenment, liberalism, like more freedom of conscience, like maybe instead you could think about the actual, multi-generational, many thousand year long tradition threads through Western history of people being able to get together in independence from any sort of theocratic piety or bureaucratic regime, and genuinely seeking the good and the beautiful. That thing's a hothouse plant, and we know because they killed Socrates. Like, this is something that you have to have extremely rarefied conditions to do and to conduct. And all organizations, I think, are vulnerable to capture by the reigning powers. And the people who currently run all academic conferences of, any note, the APSA being no exception, and unfortunately the Discipline of Classics also being no exception, are increasingly becoming captured by the reigning theocracy, and they only don't see it because it's ostensibly secular. They think that this is like some, brave new world where everything is released from, structures of power and hierarchies, and actually, like, we're the rebels, we're the resistance, we're speaking truth to power. And yeah, Ryan, it's deeply, deeply sad to see all of these places which once did, on some terms and with certain constraints and caveats, enable people to come together and talk sometimes about boring stuff that was deeply, profoundly interesting to them and would have consequences down the line for their students and for other people with kind of more public careers. Like, yeah, that's a really, really hard thing to do. It's also the only thing that legitimately earns the name of scholarship or of philosophy. And I think the sooner people realize that, like, that endeavor was always in a kind of uncomfortable marriage with the institution called the university, which steadily, much like the Christian church, gained a degree of power which was inherently unhealthy for its reigning ideals and ideas, right? Then you'll realize that we don't need these clowns, right? Like, those people were always kind of, the structures that we built around the Socratic pursuit and the philosophical endeavor were always bound to kind of like collapse. Their lifespan compared to the lifespan of the great conversation and the great idea of pursuing the truth, the lifespan of these institutions is as the lifespan of a gnat, and we can mourn them as we watch them fall into dust. But they are nothing. The kings and the regimes of the world pass, and the truth remains.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that you're gonna find, like, I don't know, a microgram of courage or spine among academic conference organizers, I don't know. I feel like that hope faded a long time ago.
The overarching thing here for me is, like, what does political science, academic political science, have to say about what's going on right now? If you think that Kagan is lacking, just try reading, one of the mainstream political science journals in America. They're smart people. They do the work. They apply themselves. They try to care about continuing on a sort of self-serious academic tradition, but it's events have far outstripped what these people are doing, and they are dispositionally and institutionally blocked from confronting what is unfolding and why. From their complete inability to conduct real interdisciplinary research across political theory and media theory, to the identity politics rituals that they must perform at every turn, to the sad fact that Pascal Emmanuel Gobry had a great thread on this the other day about how academics used to be these sort of befuddly geniuses who had a certain panache or charisma to them, and now they're just burned out, exhausted, bedraggled functionaries like everyone else in the establishment. The glamour, such as it was, the sort of tatty, patch-elbowed glamour of the academy is gone, and it's not coming back in the same way that all the great foundations on the right that used to keep generations of conservative academics, true academics, afloat and find them ways of carrying on the careers, those shuttered decades ago, and they're not coming back. So what I see a moribund discipline, and it's sad in its way, but it's time to dry those tears and move on.
Yeah, well, as Ryan well knows, I still have not shed a tear about the inevitable move out of APSA. I mean, I would just like kind of give a practical view of that situation. Everything everyone said is absolutely correct, and it takes some time to leave a system that is this rotten, because these things do in any given person's lifetime exert some kind of force and control. But I think what this is a sign of ultimately is that the academy has hollowed out so much that you just can't be a part of it anymore if you're seriously pursuing the truth or pursuing these questions. And it's turned into something that, is fake. A lot of it's just fake. It's not really accomplishing anything. It's sort of its own navel gazing exercise. The term political science isn't that old either, to Spencer's point, and hopefully will just die anyway, along with this metastasized, corrupt academy. And to the extent that there's real stuff within it, where people are doing real work, which is certainly true, it's there in different places, but the system is what's corrupt. They're hampered by that system. So the real pursuit of knowledge, whether you're talking about something more practical and applied or prudential, the study of politics, political action, or whether you're talking about political philosophy, looking to things that don't change. These, the pockets are there, but it's so burdened by all this garbage that has taken over. It's just very inefficient. So when you think about this, what does this mean practically? It means that if Claremont, hosts something for all people trying to do something real, they'll probably all gravitate towards it, and it could be public. People could watch and see what's being spoken of and discussed. And it's like when you think about taking things out of the burdensome academic journals and just letting people be free and publishing interesting things, like that's how the whole thing starts. And so, I think it's just another sad sign that the academy really is this corrupt. And I think more and more people realize that, but still not enough. It's at the point now where, of course, we have to cut ties, and we can't even show up in person because they will protest, and there is real fear of that protest and fallout of having a single person among hundreds of people that would show up, a single person who happened to support the wrong political party. And of course, you could have, the left will have convicted felons show up and feed them at these events, and complete morons and idiots and charlatans get up on stage and say idiotic things. And I mean, at the end of the day, I would just say, look, if you're still in the academy, if you can, I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it, get the hell out. But if you can't or feel a vocation there, you have to move to centers and to, I don't need to tell anyone this, they already know, but you have to move to centers and to institutions where, that aren't corrupt, and you need to do so as soon as possible, because this is all coming down. And the next step will be, I think, some kind of collapse. But I also think a certain strain of the university will be just pure re-education camp, which plays a very important role, and they're not going to let that go, and it's still needed. It's just it'll have completely transformed into something else in front of everyone's eyes. But anyway, I shed no tears. It's a matter of time, and APSA is awful. The discipline of political science is awful, and these structures aren't addressing any real problems. And there's very little good work that is being done there. And to the extent it is being done, it's just hampered by these people. And I mean, at the end of the day, I guess what Seth said, I just would reiterate, there's such cowardice here. So many of them, I mean, I almost like the activists threatening us online, those kinds of political scientists, and I like them better than the cowards who don't have the guts to kind of say what's really going on.
Yeah, Matt, it's kind of amazing that we're having this conversation while Ibram X. Kendi, a man whose entire ideology and career is constructed not just out of bromides, but poorly constructed and manifestly false bromides, like the only remedy to present discrimination is more future discrimination. This is a man who just won a MacArthur Genius grant. That's $625,000 for those keeping track at home, but who's counting, right? It could have been $10 and it would have been too much to award to a man of this kind of intellectual stature. And John Eastman is who you were afraid of. Ibram X. Kendi is a man who has fundamentally declared himself antithetical to the American regime. And you're worried that John Eastman is going to bring the thing down around your ears? I mean, that part of it alone just kind of like points up the absurdity of it. And to Seth's point, right, shows you that you should never really expect anything from a set of institutions that's behaving this way. To your point, Matt, about these places don't exist to help or advance the search for truth, right? It goes, I think, even one step further than that, which is that they exist to hinder that. They're every day, not just for the people who are in their employ or for graduate students who are studying for PhDs and the incentive structures that are set up there, but for regular people who have to listen to the constant drumbeat, to have just the slop poured on their head for hours on end every day when they log on to Twitter or watch the news, right? They see the just garbage nonsense that comes out of the language distortion, the way that they talk about women, and the way they talk about race, right? All of this is designed effectively to dig an epistemological pit under your feet so that instead of starting from your basic observations and common sense, then working your way up to higher truth, as was, from time immemorial, the procedure of those who cared to think or examine their lives, right? Instead, you have to just dig your way up every day out of this morass, this pit of nonsense that they invent to basically make the world look like the opposite of what it is. So yeah, get out.
I mean, just one very quick thing. I guess I think it may have been Chomsky who pointed out that a real science doesn't have to have the word science in its title. Like nobody says like the Department of Chemistry Science. And I guess on the left, I used to hear this joke calling it like political silence in terms of like what it is that they actually do, just like, quash any real discussion. So just those two things I thought were kind of funny.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. And I mean the politics and history used to be drawn together, and then a dollop of sociology and some crappy level knowledge of stats, and all of a sudden you have the discipline of political science, which can never decide whether it's are you actually trying to tell me how to get elected? That's one thing. We can test that and see if you know your stuff, or are you trying to do something more speculative, like come up. Obtain some knowledge of the truth with your stats applied to human nature, but the whole thing has been tenuous from the beginning. And there's a great thing I like to think when they started to say, well, we need people who aren't from America. At one point, they had an announcement to join our leadership team, and I was kind of thinking to myself, so the American Political Science Association is not American. It's not truly political. It's not science. I don't know. Is it an association? Maybe.
Yeah.
Peace. Bye-bye.
Yeah, it's also there's also the irony. I don't, you hadn't brought this up yet, Matt, but it's one of your, I don't think, but it's one of your the things you always do. We've said it before too when talking about APSA, which is that when it's in Washington, D.C., nobody sends any staffers there. Nobody cares about it. Anyone in actual practical politics doesn't care. I wanted to just close us out with this. I found one more title. This is Mark Hemingway, his report actually from that conference at which John Yoo was protested, which I was incorrect. It was 2017 in San Francisco. And Mark went to a panel called "White Genocide is going to get your mama." That was the name of the panel. He'd been to a serious one, and then he went to this new one. He says, so he's reporting about the one he came from. This is, if you want to look it up, this is from the Weekly Standard Archives at the Washington Examiner. Just look up Mark Hemingway Academic Gabfest, and you can see his report from 2017. These, of course, are thoughtful reflections. He's talking about the panel he just was at on the reasons for the ebbing legitimacy of political science. But to be blunt, while thoughtfulness may sell books to a general audience, it's not clear there's an academic market for it. Leftist radicalism is a different story. Just after the foreign policy experts discussion, there's another panel at the Hilton. White Genocide is going to get your mama, and it's far better attended. The title is ironic, but not in a way that's reassuring. One of the speakers, Associate Professor George Gio Cicciarello Mar, was censured by his employer, Drexel University, after tweeting last December, "All I want for Christmas is white genocide." He followed that up with, "To clarify, when the whites were massacred during the Haitian Revolution, that was a good thing indeed." Cicciarello Mar says the tweets were meant to draw attention to the belief among racists that there's some organized institutional plan to kill whites en masse. Mar has also tweeted that someone who gave up his first class seat to a uniformed soldier made him want to vomit. According to Mar and his fellow panelists, this notion of impending white genocide is a widespread cultural meme. For instance, Columbia University professor Mark Lilla criticized the Black Lives Matter movement for using counterproductive Mau Mau tactics in a New Yorker interview last month, an allusion Lilla specified to a famous Tom Wolfe essay, Mau Mauing the Flatcatchers. if none of you have read that, Radical Chic and Mau Mauing the Flat Catchers, it's in book form. Go get it. I continue. Whose subject was intimidation, not killing. Nonetheless, panelist Nikhil Paul Singh characterizes Lilla's observation this way. Here's a serious liberal intellectual essentially saying activist groups are out there who want to kill white people. Princeton's Kianga Yamahata Taylor, can't make up all these names, weighs in with all manner of splenetic thoughts on white genocide, including that the GOP is, in my opinion, a thoroughly racist party that has completely racist policies, and that Trump has unequivocally expressed sympathy, admiration, and solidarity for white supremacy in the United States. Finally, here's the kicker, and this is that ties it into our John Yoo panel experience. After their initial presentation, the panelists then take a moment to help plan a protest against another APSA speaker, George W. Bush administration official John Yoo, for his role in writing memos offering legal justification for waterboarding terrorists. This will bear fruit the next day during Yoo's panel, which is about the need to limit executive authority. A group of APSA attendees stand silently in front of the dais, holding signs, and two people later charge into the ballroom yelling. Now a law professor at Berkeley, Yoo has no doubt grown accustomed to being protested and is unfazed. That panel was ours. It's the one we mentioned. So this is the state of modern political science. Now that was in 2017. If you think it's gotten better since then, I have a bridge to tell you. With that, thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and our Washington, D.C. Center for the American Way of Life, dc.claremont.org. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate us well. It helps spread the word. And thank you, as always, to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Alyssa Lee. And thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.